Hello, and thank you for showing up for our panel today. My presentation is about the foreign policies of the Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney progressive conservative governments. And I have a few key objectives today, and I'm hoping to provide a fairly high-level overview of a number of key topics. First, I want to consider some process pieces. What were these governments and ministers trying to do vis-a-vis the Department of External Affairs? What factors shaped the process of setting foreign policy priorities? How did these ministers and governments try to engage with Parliament and also the broader Canadian public? Second key set of issues relates to what priorities and values were guiding Canadian foreign policy activities in this period. What were the methods being used to try to get various things done? And do we see continuities or contrasts with the Liberals? Third, and finally, is the much bigger question, and I probably won't be able to fully resolve it in my presentation today, and that is, how might we define and understand a progressive conservative Canadian foreign policy from this era? And through all of this, I should note that I'm not trying to be overly revisionist about this progressive conservative era, but I do perhaps want to challenge some preconceptions that people have when the word conservative pops up, and to argue that there are different variants of conservatism, and the progressive conservatism of the 70s and 80s is rather different from what we have today, and that had ramifications for how Canada and its ministers interacted with the rest of the world. My talk is drawn from an ongoing research project that is aiming to create a larger political biography of the life of Joe Clark. My comments today draw not only on archival materials I've been looking at, but also quite heavily on the oral history interviews that I've conducted with Mr. Clark's parliamentary colleagues, his senior staffers, and the diplomats and public servants who worked for external affairs, as it was then called in this period. Conducting interviews over Zoom and Skype, I should add, was one of the few pieces of original research that I've been able to really keep moving forward on throughout this pandemic. I'll be saying a bit more about the Clark-Mulroney dynamic soon because it is a central one and it occupies most of this period. But before that, as I start my conversation about process, I want to highlight one of the most significant dimensions to me of this era, and that is the centrality of women and of feminism to the foreign policy portfolio in this era. Much has been made, and rightly so, of Chrystia Freeland's recent performance as Minister of Global Affairs. But it's also worth noting that Freeland is not the first woman to have held that portfolio. She's in fact the third, and the first two were progressive conservatives from this era. Flora MacDonald was in fact the first, when she was appointed by Prime Minister Clark to be his Secretary of State for External Affairs, as the portfolio was then known. And the second was Barbara McDougall, who took the portfolio over from Clark in 1991 when he was redeployed to the Constitutional Affairs portfolio several months after the collapse of the Meech Lake Accord. During the years when Clark himself was in External Affairs, the International Affairs Cabinet team also featured other high-profile women in associated cabinet roles. During the peak years of negotiating the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, Pat Carney was the Minister of International Trade. And the junior portfolio of Minister of External Relations, which in these years largely was responsible for official development assistance and la francophonie, was held by Monique Vézina from 1984 to 1986, and then Monique Landry from 1986 to 1991. I draw your attention to this partly because of the importance of these firsts, but more so because feminism was a particular preoccupation and defining characteristic of Clark's approach to government. As Prime Minister, he had charged his Director of Political Appointments, Jean Piggott, with identifying women who could be promoted into senior roles. And although that process got cut short along with his government when it fell on the budget vote, he did appoint Jean Castleman-Watts as Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. This desire to promote women within areas where he had influence carried over into his years as Secretary of State for External Affairs, where he often butted heads with the old boys network of the department to try to hasten the process of promoting women into senior roles, such as heads of mission positions. A high-profile example of this was Louise Fréchette, who was appointed ambassador to Argentina under Clark, and who would later go on to become the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Clark's own office was led and supported by senior political staff, including a number of very highly positioned women, including Jody White, Peggy Mason, Susan Elliott, and a number of others. Feminism was not just a factor about who was helping set foreign policy priorities and implementing them, but also about what was being done. And you see priorities such as promoting issues like women in development, for example. Continuing on this topic of process issues, during both the period of Clark as Prime Minister and Clark as Secretary of State for External Affairs, the foreign policy process put a premium on engaging Canadians directly in Canada's external relations and its engagement with the world. And this manifested in a few key forms. First off, you see it in policy reviews. There had been an abortive foreign policy review under Clark's own government, cut short by its fall, but then this was taken up again in his first year as External Affairs Minister. And it's a process that made use of a special joint parliamentary committee and also invited widespread public input, ultimately resulting in the Independence and Internationalism report. This review process was part of the reason why issues related to Central America ended up being given higher priority by External Affairs in the 1980s, as I'll discuss a bit later, because there was such an outpouring of public submissions on that region. In subsequent years, defense and international development policies were also subject to these wide-ranging reviews and produced reports on future directions. Now, we can debate how much impact these reviews ultimately had, but they were definitely part of a desire that was particularly strong on Clark's part to get the Canadian public to take an interest in Canadian foreign policy, to engage with it, and to see it as relevant. These consultations frequently happened on a much smaller scale as well. Clark's archival files are chock-a-block with requests from him to his staff to convene smaller groups of people, very often drawn from outside the department, with various constituencies across the political spectrum in Canadian academia, labor, nonprofits, and community groups to discuss specific foreign policy issues. Perhaps one of the better known and more significant of these consultations followed the Chinese government's crackdown on the Tiananmen Square demonstrations in the spring of 1989. And very shortly thereafter, Clark had his officials convene Chinese-Canadian community leaders from across the country to consult on what they wanted Canada's response to be, which informed the steps that the government then took. I want in particular to highlight two high-profile examples of how these governments tried to directly engage Canadians on international crises and to make use of Canadians' desire to take action. The Indo-Chinese refugee crisis was peaking as Clark came into office in 1979, and responding to the desire of Canadians to do more than they had been, Red Tory ministers Flora MacDonald in External Affairs and Immigration Minister Ron Atke urged the cabinet to significantly increase Canada's refugee intake, and they had strong support from Clark on this. Over the summer and fall of 1979, the government steadily increased its targets for refugees from this part of the world. They raised them first to 12,000 for 1979-80, and then up to a total of 50,000. When the target was raised to 50,000 by the end of 1980, the government also changed how the numbers would be allocated and allowed for a significantly higher level of private sponsorship of refugees to respond to public demand. And what was going to happen was that the government would match on a one-to-one basis up to 21,000 additional refugees beyond its original commitment of 8,000. So you get 21,000 government-sponsored, 21,000 private, and then the original 8,000. I would note that the government did so despite polls showing that a small majority of Canadians were opposed to accepting such high numbers, and a full-page ad opposed to this was run by the National Citizens Coalition in the Globe and Mail in August of 1979. However, the outpouring of public interest in privately sponsoring refugees reached the extent that by late 1979, it appeared that even this target of 21,000 privately sponsored refugees was going to be exceeded. And so in November, Cabinet decided to keep to the overall total target of 50,000, but allow private sponsorship to sort of find its own level within that target. And if it exceeded 21,000, the government would spend funds it had earmarked for government-sponsored refugees to food and medical aid overseas, and transferring money to volunteer agencies involved in relief efforts for the refugee crisis. Now, this issue is a lot more complex than I've very quickly sketched it here, and there was criticism that the government had backed down from its commitment to 29,000 Canadian government-sponsored refugees, because the ministers didn't want to exceed the overall target of 50,000. But it's nonetheless important, and I wanted to highlight two things. First is that there was this red Tory strain in forming refugee policy that favored higher levels of admissions. And second was the decision of the government to tap into personal and private initiative of Canadians in support of this foreign policy objective. So rather than just having the government take over a larger number of refugees entirely, they took advantage of and encouraged public buy-in and participation in the refugee resettlement effort. We can also see some parallels, particularly on this public involvement dimension, in Canada's response to the Ethiopian famine of the mid-1980s. As Nasise Solomon has discussed in her work, Canadians, Joe Clark, and the Canadian government ended up playing a crucial role in bringing this famine to broader public attention. There was a film documentary by CBC reporter Brian Stewart that aired on November the 1st of 1984 that really brought this tragedy into Canadian homes. But then this attention was amplified by Clark's decision to divert the Canadian plane that was conveying him and a number of other government leaders home from Indira Gandhi's funeral to make a stop off in Ethiopia on the way home, thereby garnering more press coverage for this issue. Upon his return, David MacDonald, a former cabinet minister in Clark's government and a very prominent Red Tory, was tasked with coordinating a nonpartisan approach to Canadian efforts at relief as the emergency coordinator for the African famine. And part of his role was about coordinating Canadian private donations and initiatives to support famine relief. Again, trying to get direct Canadian engagement in the response and allowing that to complement the targeted Canadian government official development assistance dollars. And Canadians contributed over $35 million by the middle of 1986 towards this effort, on top of Canada's official commitments. The response to Ethiopia also involved creative approaches, like twinning communities in Canada and Ethiopia to provide resources. And as Solomon details in her work, a series of Forum Africa symposia were held in over 50 communities across the country to engage with Canadians who wanted to take part in various types of actions. In both of these cases, Ethiopia and Southeast Asia, we can see the progressive conservative government's desire to involve Canadians personally and directly and their resources in foreign policy. This was not done, I'd argue, in such a way as to privatize or offload that response. It was really more about leveraging that personal and private interest in foreign policy to supplement, enhance, and provide public support for the governmental response. I need to say a bit about the dynamics of how foreign policy was managed at the highest political levels, particularly during the years of the Mulroney government when Clark was in external affairs, because there were worries that the two men could not work together given the history of their rivalry for the party leadership. Now, as it turned out, they worked very well together and were extremely professional about their working relationship. And there was sort of an informal divvying up of responsibilities in ways that suited both men's strengths and interests. Prime Minister Mulroney took the lead on summitry, as you would expect the head of the government to do. And because of his role in summits, Mulroney also took the lead on Europe, East-West relations, NATO, and La Francophonie. Mulroney also took the lead on the Canada-US relationship and economic issues, which of course included the Free Trade Agreement. While Clark was the senior international relations minister, it was the international trade minister who handled those sorts of issues around the cabinet table, with Mulroney as the public face. Clark took a particular interest in the developing world, especially Africa, Latin America, and to a lesser extent Asia, as well as issues related to development assistance. And Clark really had an interest in the nuts and bolts of foreign policy, and of consensus and coalition building, and was allowed by Mulroney to pursue those interests and to run with them. So what were some of the other hallmarks of the progressive conservative foreign policy of the Clark-Mulroney era? There's no way to fully do justice to the ambitious foreign policy agenda that was followed in those years, but it's very important to underline that both Clark and Mulroney were activist-minded when it came to Canada's international agenda. The top priority, and as I mentioned, where Mulroney took the lead, was on rebuilding a constructive and positive engagement with the United States and engaging in good allyship with its major partner. During these years, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, talks for which launched in 1985, was the highest profile element of the foreign policy agenda. And although this agreement is and was entangled in questions of neoliberalism and sovereignty, it's important to recall that the context was one of an American Congress being significantly more protectionist, and seeking a trade deal was first and foremost about securing stable access for Canadian exports to US markets. There's also a larger goal here in the relationship between Canada and the US with regards to constructive engagement, and it benefited from a sympathetic interlocutor in American Secretary of State George Shultz. Throughout the period where Clark and Shultz held their respective offices, they held quarterly meetings to tend the garden of irritants between the two countries. And there were several issues in the mix here, and the hope was to address them in a congenial manner. That included Canada declining to take part in the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars as it was dubbed. It included the development of an interim diplomatic solution to the question of sovereignty in Arctic waters in light of the passage of the Polar Sea icebreaker, and also trying to facilitate movement to reduce emissions that were contributing to acid rain. As regards Canadian activity for the rest of the world, one guiding principle or hallmark was that Clark and Mulroney wanted to take actions on issues where Canada could make a meaningful difference. As Derek Burney put it, it's helpful to use the metaphor of Canada being like a little brother to an incredibly accomplished, for better or for worse, sibling. And when you're completely overshadowed by that sibling, there's a desire to make your name where and how you can. And Canada's international activities in this period were often on topics or issues where the United States would not or could not take the lead. And often this meant having to act multilaterally through international organizations because Canada was at best a middle power. But it was a member of the G7, the Commonwealth, La Francophonie, NATO, the United Nations, and later, as of 1990, the Organization of American States. And it's through those bodies that Canada tried to engage. And I'm just going to briefly highlight a couple of those activities. Broadly speaking, Clark took an interest in Africa and especially in Southern and South Africa. Both Clark and Mulroney had come of age politically when Prime Minister Diefenbaker had opposed South Africa's readmission to the Commonwealth, and the issue of actively opposing apartheid was very important to both men. Clark and Mulroney took advantage of Canada's position as a member of all three of the G7, Commonwealth, and La Francophonie to press for action on this issue, to the particular irritation of Margaret Thatcher. Mulroney played a key role at the Commonwealth Summit at Nassau to press for action and the creation of an eminent persons group to help facilitate negotiating a peaceful transition to majority rule in South Africa. Clark at Nassau had private meetings with representatives of the African National Congress. And Clark also played a central role in bodies created by the Commonwealth to coordinate joint actions, including chairing the Commonwealth Committee of Foreign Ministers on South Africa, a group that was created to coordinate joint action in between summits of this body. Contemporary observers and scholars since then have critiqued some elements of Canada's approach, often on the basis of a failure to enact dramatic full-fledged sanctions, which Mulroney had threatened to do in a speech to the United Nations. But Canada clearly went further than any of its G7 allies in many respects, including breaking ground in meetings with the ANC, and it was recognized for its efforts by Nelson Mandela, who made a point of visiting Canada in 1990 upon his release from prison. The approach of the Mulroney government towards constructive engagement also is evident vis-a-vis Latin America, and you see significantly greater attention to the region, at least in part in response to the outpouring of public submissions to the 1985 Foreign Policy Review. And that included support for the Contadora peace process in Central America. It included increased official development aid. And a visible signal of this was Canada's official adhesion to the Organization of American States in 1990, and then ultimately engaging in negotiations to join a North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico. A moment ago, I mentioned that Nelson Mandela's visit to Canada occurred in 1990, and that was just days before the Meech Lake Accord completely died. The foreign policy of the later years of the Mulroney government was affected by the fact that its focus was really on domestic issues. And that's not to say that Canada completely withdrew from the world, but it was much more reactive as opposed to being proactive on key issues that were of interest to Canada. But it did continue to engage multilaterally, including contributing militarily to the Gulf War when Canada was a member of the UN Security Council. Overall, as a brief conclusion, I would argue that Canada's foreign policy under these progressive conservative ministers was an activist one. While there was a clear preoccupation with rebuilding the Canada-US relationship, it would be an error to limit our understanding of that period to that sole issue. The red Tory strain of social progressivism was abundantly clear on a number of the policy priorities of this era that I've touched on. And so too was the desire of these governments to engage with the broader Canadian public and a broad cross-section of interests, and to respond to those interests in new policy directions. It's not a perfect record, and I recognize the many critiques that have and could be raised about aspects of it, but I would argue that here, as in other elements of the record of these governments and their parties, we still see clear indications of the progressive element of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, as it was called in this period. And while there's far more I could say, I'm happy to leave that for the question and answer period and to engage with you and my co-panelists then. Thank you.